Introduction: the divine in the details. The sacred isn't waiting on a mountaintop or hidden behind grand doors. It's in the steam rising from your morning coffee, in the rhythm of your footsteps on a quiet walk, in the gentle weight of someone's hand resting in yours. The divine is not far, it's here. But only if we're still enough to notice. The search for the extraordinary. We live in a world addicted to spectacle. We chase mountaintop moments, grand gestures, and lightning strike revelations. We imagine God, or whatever we name the divine, as something distant, otherworldly, only accessible through great effort or profound transformation. We climb metaphorical mountains, hoping for enlightenment. We chase gurus, rituals, and spiritual highs. And yet, we often return home to our ordinary lives feeling empty, like something essential remains just out of reach. But what if we've been looking in the wrong places? What if God isn't hiding in the extraordinary, but waiting quietly in the ordinary? In the middle of a crowded grocery store, in the exhausted sigh of a parent putting their child to bed, in the first light of dawn spilling across an empty room, there is something sacred. It doesn't demand your attention. It doesn't shout or wave its arms. It waits, patient, quiet, and endlessly available. But we often miss it. We miss it because we're distracted by our phones, our schedules, our worries, our desire for something bigger. We miss it because we've convinced ourselves that the sacred must be grand. We miss it because we've forgotten how to see. But the truth is, holiness isn't reserved for stained glass windows and holy mountains. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. It's in the way sunlight hits the kitchen floor in the morning. It's in the way your breath slows when you listen to a favorite song. It's in the stillness between words in a deep conversation. These moments aren't placeholders for something better. They are the sacred. There's a story about a wise teacher who was asked where God could be found. "Everywhere," the teacher replied. "But where should I look first?" the student pressed. The teacher smiled and said, "Start with where you are." This book is an invitation to do just that, to start where you are. Not in some distant monastery, but in your living room. Not in some future moment when you've figured it all out, but in this moment, right now. Not in someone else's story, but in your own quiet life. Everyday moments are doorways to the sacred. All we have to do is notice. Imagine this. You're washing the dishes after dinner. The sink is full of warm, soapy water, and your hands are submerged as you scrub a stubborn stain from a plate. It's quiet except for the faint sound of water running and the hum of the refrigerator. For a brief moment, your mind stops racing. The endless stream of worries, plans, and distractions pauses. And in that stillness, you feel it, a softness, a quiet presence, a sense that this moment isn't just washing dishes. It's something more. It's holy. It's an ordinary act infused with extraordinary presence. But noticing the divine in ordinary moments isn't easy. It requires something rare in our world, attention. Attention is not the same as looking. Looking is passive, attention is active. Attention says, "I am here. I am awake. I am ready to see." Attention asks us to slow down, to breathe, to let go of our endless striving and sink into the small, often overlooked corners of our day. It asks us to stop scrolling, stop rushing, stop numbing, and just be. And when we do, something extraordinary happens. The ordinary begins to glow. The small becomes significant. The quiet becomes full. This book isn't a guide to finding God in faraway places. It's not a manual for spiritual achievement. It's a gentle reminder that the divine isn't waiting in the clouds, it's waiting in the cracks. In the spaces where light filters in the pause between breaths, in the messy, beautiful reality of daily life. Holiness isn't elsewhere, it's here. And it's waiting for you to notice. What if holiness isn't somewhere else, but right here, waiting to be noticed? Take a moment. Pause. Look around you. Is there light falling across a table? A faint breeze brushing against your skin? The distant sound of laughter? These aren't distractions from something more important. They're the important thing. Holiness isn't a reward for being good enough, spiritual enough, or enlightened enough. It's a gift, and it's already here. All you have to do is notice. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how the sacred reveals itself in ordinary spaces, in pauses, in relationships, in nature, in the rhythm of daily life. There will be stories, reflections, and gentle invitations to see, not with your eyes, but with your heart. This isn't a journey to somewhere distant. It's a journey home. Home to the ordinary holiness of the world around you. Home to the quiet sanctity of your own life. Home to the truth that God isn't far away, God is here. Take a breath. Settle in. The sacred is waiting. Welcome to the Sacred Ordinary, finding God in everyday moments. Written and published by Mindful Literary. Chapter 1. The Pause Before the Prayer. Sometimes the most sacred moments aren't planned. They arrive softly, in the space between one breath and the next. They don't demand our attention, they invite it. The leaf that fell. The city was loud, an endless chorus of honking horns, distant sirens, and hurried footsteps against wet pavement. People weaved around each other on crowded sidewalks, faces buried in phone screens, shoulders hunched against the wind. In the middle of this sea of motion, Sam walked briskly, a coffee cup in one hand and his phone in the other. His calendar app glowed brightly, screaming reminders about meetings, deadlines, and missed calls. His mind was everywhere except where his body was. Then it happened. Just as he stepped onto a small patch of grass beside an office building, a single yellow leaf drifted down in front of him. It wasn't extraordinary. It wasn't glowing or dancing in slow motion. It was just falling. But something in that ordinary moment stopped Sam in his tracks. His feet froze. His phone lowered. His breath caught. The leaf twirled lazily in the crisp autumn air, caught a glimmer of light, and landed softly on the damp earth. For a few seconds, maybe 5, maybe 10, everything around Sam seemed to blur into the background. The traffic, the noise, the notifications, they all faded. All that remained was the leaf. And him. When the moment passed, Sam felt something shift inside him. A quiet space had opened, something small but profound. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't an answer. It was just stillness. And it felt sacred. Stillness is uncomfortable for most of us. We fill our days with noise, with tasks, with distractions that keep our minds moving and our hands busy. Silence feels foreign. Pausing feels wasteful. But beneath the discomfort lies something we rarely allow ourselves to feel: presence. Stillness isn't empty, it's full. Full of clarity, full of breath, full of the quiet murmur of life itself. But stillness can also be frightening because it confronts us with ourselves, our thoughts, our doubts, our fears. So we avoid it. We keep scrolling. We keep running. We keep filling every gap with something. But what if, just for a moment, we didn't? There's a kind of magic in the pauses, the space between one word and the next, one breath and the next, one thought and the next. It's in those spaces that we catch glimpses of something deeper, something other. When Sam paused for that leaf, when he let the world slow down for just a few seconds, he wasn't escaping his life. He was entering it more fully. The world didn't stop. Time didn't freeze. But for a brief moment, he was there. Fully, completely, and beautifully there. And in that moment, the ordinary became sacred. We often think of prayer as something formal, something said with words, hands folded, eyes closed. But prayer can also be a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness in the middle of chaos. When Sam watched that leaf fall, he wasn't saying anything. He wasn't asking for anything, but he was present. And maybe that's what prayer is, a moment of deep, still presence in the middle of a world that never stops moving. A moment when we set down our burdens, our plans, our expectations, and simply be. It's in those pauses that the sacred has room to speak. Pausing isn't about escaping reality. It's about entering it more fully. It's about noticing the way sunlight spills across your kitchen table. It's about hearing the faint sound of birdsong, even as traffic hums in the distance. It's about feeling the warmth of a cup of tea in your hands, really feeling it, before you take a sip. These pauses don't have to be long. They don't have to be profound. They just have to be real. The sacred isn't absent from our lives. It's just often drowned out by the noise. The noise of worry. The noise of ambition. The noise of endless tasks and notifications. But the sacred doesn't need fanfare to make itself known. Sometimes it arrives as softly as a falling leaf. The question is, will we notice? Right now, in this moment, pause. Take a breath. Notice something small around you. The way the light hits the floor. The sound of your own breath. The texture of the chair you're sitting on. Don't rush past it. Don't analyze it. Just notice. That's where it begins. Can we learn to pause long enough to notice what's already here? Ask yourself, when was the last time I truly paused? What small moments have I missed because I was too busy, too distracted, too hurried? What might I notice if I allowed myself just one quiet moment today? You don't need to climb a mountain to encounter the divine. You don't need perfect silence or perfect circumstances. You just need a pause. Because in that pause, the world changes, not because it's different, but because you are. When Sam walked away from that patch of grass, the leaf still lay there, glistening faintly in the weak afternoon sun. The city was still loud. His phone was still full of notifications. But something in him had shifted. For a moment, he had seen it, the sacredness hidden in the ordinary. And he carried that moment with him, tucked somewhere quiet in his chest. This is your invitation. Pause. Breathe. Notice. Because sometimes the sacred isn't in the extraordinary. Sometimes it's in a single leaf falling gently to the earth. The sacred is waiting. Can you pause long enough to see it? Chapter 2. The Kitchen as a Temple. In a world obsessed with grand gestures and sacred spaces, the kitchen remains quietly holy. A place where the ordinary becomes extraordinary, where simple acts become rituals, and where every meal prepared is, in some way, an offering. The woman and the meal. The kitchen was small, cluttered with jars of spices, half-used bags of rice, and a faint smell of garlic lingering in the air. The window above the sink let in soft afternoon light, casting golden patterns across the worn wooden counter. Mira stood at the cutting board, her knife gliding through a ripe tomato with practiced precision. Each slice was deliberate, each motion unhurried. The faint thud-thud-thud of the knife hitting the board was the only sound in the room, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't distracted. She was present. The onions were sautéing in a skillet nearby, their sharp aroma transforming into something sweet and inviting. Mira stirred them slowly, watching them turn translucent, golden soft. To anyone watching, it was just cooking, just a woman making dinner on an ordinary day. But to Mira, it felt like something else. It felt like prayer. Not in words spoken aloud, not in hands pressed together, but in the quiet intention behind every motion. The way she washed the rice, as though she were cleansing it of its past journey. The way she stirred the soup, tasting and adjusting with gentle care. The way she plated the meal, each element placed thoughtfully, as though it were art. When the meal was finished, Mira sat at her small kitchen table with her plate in front of her. She bowed her head, not out of ritual, but out of gratitude. And for a moment, the kitchen didn't feel ordinary. It felt sacred. When we think of temples, we imagine stained glass, incense smoke curling in the air, and candlelight flickering on polished wood. But the kitchen? The kitchen is sticky countertops, mismatched mugs, and the hiss of water hitting a hot skillet. And yet, what happens in the kitchen is deeply sacred. A loaf of bread rising in the oven. A grandmother stirring soup with tired but steady hands. A child licking frosting from a wooden spoon. These moments carry a holiness all their own, not because of what is being made, but because of how it's being made. When done with intention, cooking becomes an act of care, an act of love, an act of reverence. Every chop, every stir, every simmer is an offering, one given not to an altar, but to life itself. For many of us, the kitchen feels more like a chore than a temple. We rush through cooking, checking our phones between stirring pots. We eat standing at counters or in front of screens, barely tasting what we've made. We wash dishes with resentment, counting each plate and fork as another task in an endless to-do list. But what if we slowed down? What if we approached cooking, and every small task in the kitchen, not as a burden, but as a ritual? Because rituals aren't just found in monasteries or ancient traditions. They're found in the way we cut vegetables, brew tea, and fold napkins. Every small act has the potential to be sacred, if we let it. Mira didn't cook extravagant meals. There were no complicated recipes, no Instagram-worthy spreads. But every meal felt like an offering to herself, as she cared for her body and her hunger. An offering to her family, as she provided warmth and nourishment. An offering to the moment itself, as she let herself be fully present with the task at hand. What if we approached every act in the kitchen as an offering? Washing dishes not with irritation, but with gratitude for the food they once held. Chopping vegetables not mindlessly, but with care and intention. Eating meals not hurriedly, but with awareness and appreciation. These aren't just chores, they're rituals. And rituals are sacred not because of what we do, but because of how we do them. The way we cook, the way we clean, the way we eat, they're all reflections of how we move through life. Do we rush, distracted and detached? Do we resent the tasks in front of us, wishing they were over? Or do we show up fully, bringing care and attention to even the smallest moments? The kitchen becomes a mirror, showing us not just how we prepare food, but how we live. Are we present or are we elsewhere? Are we grateful or are we impatient? The answers are there, simmering in the soup, rising in the bread, gleaming in the clean glass of a freshly washed dish. The divine isn't loud in the kitchen. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or flashing lights. It arrives in the quiet, in the smell of garlic hitting hot oil, in the warmth of steam rising from a pot, in the way the knife slides cleanly through a ripe tomato. The divine doesn't need a cathedral. It only needs a cutting board, a skillet, and a willingness to notice. What if every act of care, every meal prepared, every dish washed, was an offering? Ask yourself, how do I approach the small tasks in my kitchen? Do I rush through them, or do I allow them to become moments of presence? What would happen if I treated every meal I prepared as an offering? The kitchen doesn't have to be a place of stress or obligation. It can be a temple. Every slice, every stir, every taste can become a prayer. And every meal can become an altar. When Mira finished her meal, she rinsed her plate under warm water. She didn't rush. She didn't resent the task. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though she were polishing something sacred. Because she was. The kitchen didn't feel ordinary anymore. It felt alive, holy, vibrant with quiet presence. And maybe Mira thought that's all prayer really is. Attention, care, gratitude. The divine had been there all along, not in the meal itself, but in the making of it. This is your invitation. Chop slowly, stir gently, wash with gratitude, because holiness isn't somewhere else. It's here, in your kitchen, in your hands, in every ordinary sacred moment. The sacred is waiting. Will you notice it? Chapter 3. The Whisper in Silence. The world is loud and our minds are louder still. But beneath the noise, beneath the endless chatter of our thoughts, there is a whisper. A quiet voice speaking not in words, but in stillness. The question is, can we hear it? The Boy and the Tree. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches of an ancient oak tree, scattering patterns of light and shadow across the grass. A warm breeze stirred the leaves, making them rustle like soft whispers. Eli sat cross-legged at the base of the tree, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His shoes were kicked off to the side, his toes sinking into the cool earth. At first, he had sat there because his father told him to. Go sit under that tree and take a break, Eli. Just be quiet for a while. But being quiet wasn't easy. For the first few minutes, Eli fidgeted. He plucked blades of grass and tied them into tiny knots. His mind was busy cataloging everything he could be doing. Climbing the tree, chasing the dog, asking his dad if they could get ice cream later. But then something shifted. The wind brushed against his cheek, soft and cool. He noticed the distant hum of bees somewhere nearby. A single leaf floated down and landed near his foot. Eli stopped fidgeting. He stopped thinking. And for a brief golden moment, he simply was. There was no grand revelation, no booming voice from the sky, no flood of insight or clarity. But there was peace. A soft, gentle peace that settled in his chest like warm sunlight. The tree, the breeze, the sky, it all felt like it was humming with something ancient and steady, something Eli couldn't name but could feel. When his father called him back to the house, Eli hesitated before standing. He placed his palm gently against the rough bark of the tree, as though saying thank you. And as he walked back, his steps slower than before, he realized something. Stillness wasn't empty. It was full. Our lives are filled with noise, external and internal. The ping of notifications, the hum of traffic, the endless cycle of worries and plans and regrets in our minds. Even when the world around us quiets, our thoughts rarely do. We fill silence with scrolling, with podcasts, with background noise on the television. Why? Because silence feels uncomfortable. It feels empty. But what if silence isn't empty at all? What if silence is where the divine speaks, not with thunderclaps, but with whispers? We often expect God, or whatever name we give the sacred, to speak loudly. We want clear answers. We want grand gestures. We want certainty, clarity, and unmistakable signs. But what if the voice of the divine isn't loud? What if it's subtle, soft, like a feather brushing against our cheek? In the Bible, there's a story about the prophet Elijah. He waits for God to speak to him, and a powerful wind comes, followed by an earthquake, and then a fire. But God isn't in any of those things. Finally, there's a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. And that's where God is. Maybe the same is true for us. Maybe the sacred doesn't arrive in grand pronouncements, but in quiet nudges. In the space between our breaths. In the stillness beneath our thoughts. Stillness isn't passive, it's active. It's not just the absence of noise. It's the presence of attention. But being still requires courage because stillness often brings us face to face with ourselves, with our fears, with our regrets, with the questions we'd rather avoid. But if we stay, if we resist the urge to fill the silence, we might hear something beneath all that noise. Not a voice with answers, but a presence. A quiet assurance that we are held, that we are seen, that we are not alone. Eli didn't hear words under the tree. There was no message, no instruction. But he felt something, a connection, a peace, a stillness that felt sacred. That's the whisper. It's not always something we can articulate. It doesn't always give us clear directions. But it's there. It's in the pause before a deep breath. It's in the way the morning light feels different on a quiet day. It's in the space where your mind stops racing, even for just a moment. It's not something you find. It's something you notice. The world will not stop being loud. Your phone will not stop buzzing. Your responsibilities will not disappear. But stillness isn't about escaping the world. It's about finding a quiet space within it. A few deep breaths in the car before you walk into a meeting. A minute of stillness before you eat your meal. A moment of silence as you sit beneath a tree and watch a leaf fall. The sacred doesn't demand hours of meditation or perfect silence. Sometimes it just needs one moment. Are we still enough to hear the quiet voice within? Ask yourself, when was the last time I let myself be truly still? What happens when I sit in silence without trying to fill it? What might I hear if I paused long enough to listen, not with my ears, but with my heart? The sacred isn't shouting at you, it's whispering. But whispers can't be heard over the noise of a restless mind or a distracted heart. Whispers require stillness. When Eli walked away from the tree, he felt lighter. Not because something had changed in the world, but because something had changed in him. The tree was still there, the leaves still rustling, the breeze still moving gently through the branches. But Eli was different. And maybe that's the secret. The divine doesn't always change our circumstances. Sometimes it changes us. This is your invitation. Find a moment today, a brief, fleeting moment, and be still. Turn off the noise. Put down the distractions. Close your eyes, or open them wide to the world in front of you. Listen, not for answers, but for presence. Because God doesn't always speak in thunderclaps. Sometimes it's just a whisper in the wind. The sacred is waiting. Can you be still enough to hear it? Chapter 4. The Stranger's Smile. Sometimes divinity arrives not in grand gestures or elaborate rituals, but in the brief crossing of two paths. A moment so fleeting it could easily be missed, yet so profound it lingers long after it's gone. The subway encounter. The subway car rattled along the tracks, filled with the usual hum of metal on metal, muffled conversations, and the faint hiss of brakes at every stop. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale glow over tired faces. Amidst the crowded car, Emily clutched her bag tightly, her earbuds in place as a shield against the world. She stared blankly at the floor, her mind running in endless loops of to-do lists, unpaid bills, and half-finished conversations. Across from her, an older man sat hunched over, a worn-out hat pulled low over his brow. His coat was threadbare, his shoes scuffed. He was staring at something far away, or perhaps nothing at all. The train jolted, and Emily's phone slipped from her hand, skidding across the floor. For a split second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. The man bent down slowly, picked up the phone, and held it out to her with trembling fingers. Emily took it, their eyes meeting briefly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the rumble of the train. The man nodded and smiled, a small, gentle smile that creased the corners of his eyes. It lasted only a moment. The train screeched to a stop, and the man stood up, gripping the overhead bar as he made his way to the door. He stepped out, disappearing into the sea of people on the platform. Emily remained frozen in her seat, her phone warm in her hand, her heart carrying a weight she couldn't quite name. It wasn't about the phone. It wasn't about the smile. It was about what passed between them. Something quiet, something invisible, something sacred. How many strangers do we pass each day without a second glance? How many faces blur into the background of our hurried lives? How often do we look through people instead of at them? In a world of constant distraction, fleeting human connections often feel insignificant, like background noise in the soundtrack of our day. But what if they aren't insignificant? What if every glance, every exchange, every small kindness carries something divine? What if God doesn't always arrive in radiant light or booming voices? but in the quiet way two strangers share a moment on a crowded train. There's an invisible space between people, something unspoken, something shared. Sometimes it's heavy with fear, distrust, or indifference. But sometimes, if we're paying attention, it feels different. It feels alive. When Emily and the old man exchanged that brief smile, something passed between them. It wasn't a transaction. It wasn't an obligation. It was presence. For just a moment, they saw each other, not as obstacles, not as strangers, but as human beings. And in that brief recognition, something sacred sparked. We shy away from these small connections because they feel vulnerable. What if they don't smile back? What if they think I'm strange? What if this interaction doesn't go anywhere? But love, and yes, these moments are small expressions of love, is always a risk. It's a risk to meet someone's eyes. It's a risk to smile first. It's a risk to say thank you with sincerity instead of politeness. But in taking that risk, we create space for something real to happen, something that transcends the mundane and brushes up against the sacred. There's an ancient teaching in many spiritual traditions. God is in every face you meet. But how often do we live like we believe that? The barista who hands you your coffee, the delivery driver dropping off a package, the stranger sitting next to you on the bus. Every single one of them carries their own story, their own grief, their own hope. And every single one of them is an opportunity, not for grand acts of charity, not for heavy conversations, but for presence, for a glance, for a smile, for a small moment where the space between two people isn't empty, but full of something sacred. Modern life has given us endless ways to communicate, but fewer ways to truly connect. We text, we scroll, we like posts on social media, but we rarely pause long enough to notice the human being in front of us. And yet, those brief, fleeting moments of connection are often the ones we remember most vividly. The stranger who held the door open on a particularly hard day. The elderly woman who complimented your scarf in the grocery store. The friend who caught your eye during a difficult moment and said everything without saying anything at all. These moments aren't small. They're everything. Emily didn't know the man's name. She would never see him again. But she carried his smile with her for weeks, maybe longer. Because it wasn't just a smile. It was a moment of recognition. It was love, distilled down to its purest form. I see you. You matter. We are here together, even if only for a moment. What if we lived like every stranger carried that same potential? What if we looked up, met eyes, and allowed ourselves to see each other? How often do we look past the people right in front of us? Ask yourself, when was the last time I made eye contact with a stranger and really saw them? Do I rush past people, lost in my own world, or do I allow myself to be present? What might change if I treated every stranger as if they carried something sacred? The divine doesn't always arrive in grand moments. Sometimes it arrives in a smile. Sometimes it arrives in a shared glance. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet acknowledgement of I see you. The train rumbled on, passengers coming and going, conversations rising and fading. Emily stayed seated, her phone still clutched in her hand, but her eyes lifted now, watching faces, noticing details. The city hadn't changed, but something inside her had. Because now she knew. God isn't always in distant heavens or ancient scriptures. Sometimes God is in a stranger's smile on a crowded train. The sacred is waiting, in the faces you pass every day. Can you slow down long enough to see it? Chapter 5. Imperfect Love as Sacred Practice. Love isn't found in grand gestures or flawless harmony. It's forged in the quiet decision to stay, to soften, to show up again and again, even when everything feels broken. In the messiness, in the pauses, in the choosing, we find the sacred. The argument. The room was quiet now, but not peaceful. The air still crackled with the remnants of raised voices and sharp words. The kitchen table stood between them like a silent witness, its surface cluttered with half-eaten plates of dinner and 2 untouched glasses of wine. Aidan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Across the room, Mira sat with her back to him, her fingers tracing the edge of her fork. It had started with something small, it always did. A forgotten chore, a missed cue, a sigh misinterpreted as irritation. Small things become sharp things when left to fester. Aidan's voice had risen first, frustration slipping out like steam from a kettle. Mira had met him word for word, her own exhaustion breaking through her usually calm facade. And now silence. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the silence of retreat, of walls going up, of love holding its breath. Aiden opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Mira stood, her chair scraping against the floor, and walked to the sink. She turned on the tap, water rushing over her hands, her shoulders rising and falling with every breath. After a long pause, she spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but softly, as though the words might break in her mouth. Aiden, I don't want us to be like this. Aiden let out a slow breath, his shoulders slumping. He crossed the room and stood beside her, close but not touching. Neither do I. For a moment, they stood side by side, the sound of water filling the quiet space between them. Mira turned off the tap and looked at him, her eyes softer now, the fire in them dimmed but still glowing faintly. I'm sorry, she said. Me too, Aiden replied. And there it was, not resolution, not perfection, but something sacred, forgiveness. It didn't erase the hurt. It didn't fix the problem entirely. But it created a crack in the wall, a space where light could get through. We are sold a story of love that is polished, effortless, and eternally harmonious. Movies end with grand declarations, books close with happily ever afters, and social media feeds overflow with curated images of picture-perfect couples. But real love? Real love isn't perfect. It's messy, raw, and deeply human. It's saying the wrong thing and then apologizing. Showing up when it's inconvenient. Choosing softness when anger feels easier. Love doesn't exist in the absence of conflict. It exists in the return. The return to humility, to listening to each other. It exists in the choice to stay, not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. Forgiveness isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet decision. It's the decision to lower your voice when you want to raise it. Stay in the room when you want to walk away. Offer grace when it feels undeserved. Forgiveness isn't about pretending the hurt didn't happen. It's not about ignoring wounds or silencing your feelings. It's about saying, I see your imperfection and I'm still here. When Aiden and Mira stood together by the sink, forgiveness wasn't wrapped in flowery words or romantic gestures. It was in their stillness, their quiet willingness to stay in the discomfort, and their choice to reach for each other instead of retreating further. That's where the sacred lives, in those small, vulnerable acts of choosing love again and again. If God is love, then God must also be in the practice of love. Not in the picture-perfect moments of Instagram-worthy harmony, but in the real moments. In the apology whispered in a kitchen at midnight. In the hand reached out across a gap of hurt feelings. In the tearful embrace after a long, hard conversation. Love isn't about getting it right all the time. It's about showing up, imperfect, tired, scared, and still choosing each other. If we can't see God in the messy, broken places of love, then we're missing one of the most sacred spaces of all. Love is inherently vulnerable because it exposes us. It exposes our fears. It exposes our flaws. It exposes the parts of ourselves we'd rather hide. That's why love hurts sometimes. But that's also why love is holy. Because every time we choose to stay, every time we choose to soften, every time we choose to forgive, we are participating in something divine. Not perfect love, but sacred love. Love isn't a feeling, it's a practice. It's not something you have, it's something you do. Every day, love asks us, will you show up when it's hard? Will you listen when it's uncomfortable? Will you forgive not once, but as many times as it takes? Mira and Aiden didn't fix everything that night. But they stayed. They softened. They chose love, even in the messiness. And in that choice, something holy happened. Can we see God in the way we love each other, even when it's messy? Ask yourself, do I expect love to be perfect? How do I respond when love feels hard or uncomfortable? Can I find the sacred in the moments of forgiveness, vulnerability, and imperfection? Love isn't clean. It isn't polished. But it's real. And in that realness, there's something deeply sacred. Aiden poured 2 fresh glasses of wine, and Mira lit a candle on the table. The kitchen was still cluttered with plates, and the air still carried faint traces of tension. But something had shifted. There was a tenderness now, a quiet space where love had been bruised but not broken. They sat together, the candle flickering between them, and spoke softly into the night. No grand apologies. No perfect resolutions. Just presence. Just 2 people showing up, imperfectly but sincerely. And maybe Mira thought this is what love really is. Not flawless, but faithful. Not grand, but sacred. The sacred is waiting, not in perfect love, but in the way we keep showing up for each other. Can you see it in the messiness? Chapter 6. the gift of presence. Presence isn't about fixing, explaining, or even comforting. It's about being here, fully, wholly, and without distraction. In a world that pulls us in 1,000 directions, to offer someone your undivided presence is to offer them something holy. The final moments. The hospice room was quiet except for the soft hum of medical equipment and the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting slivers of golden afternoon light spill across the sterile white sheets. Margaret lay in the narrow bed, her chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. Her skin was pale, her hands frail and thin like paper folded too many times. Beside her, Sarah sat in a simple wooden chair, her hands gently holding Margaret's. Sarah wasn't family. She was a caregiver, hired months ago when Margaret's family could no longer manage her care alone. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Sarah's phone buzzed faintly in her pocket, a reminder of an email, a message, a life waiting outside this room. She ignored it. Her gaze stayed on Margaret's face, her thumb tracing small circles across the back of Margaret's hand. Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly, pale blue and glassy. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Sarah leaned closer, her voice soft but steady. "I'm here, Margaret. I'm right here." The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy with meaning. There was nothing Sarah could do to change the outcome, nothing she could say to fill the silence. But her presence, her simple, quiet, unwavering presence, was enough. Margaret's eyes closed again, her lips curling slightly into the faintest smile. And Sarah stayed. In our world, attention has become a scarce resource. Our phones pull us away with every ping. Our thoughts scatter in a dozen directions at once. Our conversations are interrupted by glances at screens and fragmented focus. We exist in spaces without being there. But presence, the act of showing up fully, body and mind, without agenda or distraction, is one of the most profound gifts we can offer another person. It says, "I see you. I'm here with you. This moment matters." Sarah couldn't change Margaret's situation. She couldn't offer healing or answers, but she could offer her presence. And sometimes that's enough. Presence sounds simple, but it's deeply challenging. It asks us to put down our distractions, resist the urge to fix or solve, sit with discomfort, our own and others. When someone is hurting, dying, or grieving, our instinct is often to do something, to offer advice, to fill the silence with words, to search for solutions. But some moments can't be fixed. Some pain can't be erased. In those moments, being there fully and quietly is more valuable than any words we could speak or any task we could complete. Presence isn't about doing. It's about being. Sarah didn't need to say the perfect thing to Margaret. She didn't need to solve anything. She just needed to stay. Silence can feel heavy, awkward, even unbearable. But sometimes silence is where the sacred speaks loudest. In silence, we hold space for grief. We honor the weight of a moment. We create room for connection without expectation. Silence isn't empty, it's full. It's full of breath, full of meaning, full of love that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. When Sarah sat with Margaret, holding her hand, there was no barrier between them. No phone. No hurried thoughts. No rehearsed words. There was just being. Presence doesn't need to be grand. It doesn't require the right environment or a perfect moment. It can happen in a hospital room, in a conversation over coffee, on a crowded subway ride. The divine isn't reserved for places of worship. It exists in the stillness of a caregiver holding a hand, in the silence shared between two people who understand that nothing needs to be said. Why is it so hard to be fully present? Because presence asks us to be vulnerable, to show up without armor, to risk feeling someone else's pain, to face our own discomfort in silence and stillness. But presence also gives something back. When we show up fully for someone else, we create a bridge, one that transcends fear, ego, and distraction. That bridge is where the sacred moves. In the end, we don't remember every conversation, every task checked off our to-do list, or every notification we answered. We remember moments. The hand held tightly in a moment of fear. The quiet conversation shared at sunset. The stillness of sitting beside someone in their final hours. These are the moments that anchor us. The moments where time seems to pause and something deeper moves through us. They are moments of presence, and they are sacred. Can we be fully here in the moments that matter most? Ask yourself, when was the last time I was truly present with someone? What distractions do I need to set aside to show up fully? How would my relationships change if I brought more presence into them? Presence isn't about adding something extra to your life. It's about removing the distractions that keep you from being here, now. When Margaret passed away later that evening, Sarah sat beside her until the nurses arrived. She gathered her things, a coat, a bag, a quiet heart, and walked into the night air. Sarah didn't have words to describe what had passed between them in those final hours. But she carried it with her, a stillness, a peace, a presence that lingered like the faint scent of something holy. Because in that small room, amidst the hum of machines and the fading light, Sarah had given Margaret the greatest gift she could offer. Herself. Her presence. And in return, Margaret had given her something too. A quiet reminder that the most sacred moments aren't loud or grand or even obvious. They are still. They are shared. They are here. The sacred is waiting, not in the perfect words or grand gestures, but in your quiet, undivided presence. Can you stay long enough to feel it? Chapter 7. The Sky as Cathedral. Beneath the vast dome of the night sky, words fall away, and silence becomes sacred. In the face of something so infinite, so breathtakingly vast, we remember our smallness, and strangely, in that smallness, we find something eternal. The man and the stars. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Above him, the sky stretched endlessly, a canvas of deep indigo scattered with stars that burned like distant candles. Daniel sat on a blanket in the middle of an open field, his head tilted back, his breath visible in the cold night air. He had come here to escape the endless notifications, the demands of work, the fluorescent lights of his office that seemed to hum with exhaustion. But now, sitting beneath the night sky, escape felt like the wrong word. He wasn't escaping. He was returning. The stars blinked above him, ancient light traveling across impossible distances to meet his eyes. The Milky Way spilled across the sky like a river of light, and for a moment, Daniel felt as though he was suspended in space, weightless, timeless. He took a deep breath, and a thought brushed against him softly. This is sacred. Not because someone said it was. Not because he read it in a book or heard it in a sermon. It was sacred because it felt sacred. There, beneath the weight of the stars, Daniel felt two things at once. Small, insignificant in the face of billions of galaxies, each holding their own stories, their own stars, their own whispers of eternity. Infinite, connected to something vast and unnameable, something that existed before him and would exist long after him. It was a paradox that didn't need solving. It just was. And in that stillness, Daniel listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper. For centuries, humans have built temples, cathedrals, and mosques, beautiful spaces carved from stone and light, to reach towards the divine. But nature was the first cathedral. The sky, with its endless expanse, has always been a dome under which humanity has gathered to ask questions too big for answers. The mountains, ancient and unmoving, have been altars where prayers rise like mist. The ocean, vast and unknowable, has been both mirror and mystery. When Daniel looked at the stars, he wasn't in a church, but he was worshiping. Not in the conventional sense. There were no words, no hymns, no rituals. But there was awe. And awe, in its purest form, might just be the oldest prayer we know. Nature speaks a language older than words. It doesn't use syllables or syntax. It speaks in silence, in rhythm, in presence. The way the sky turns crimson before the sun dips below the horizon. The sound of rain tapping softly against leaves. The way a river carves through stone, patient and unrelenting. These are sacred texts, written without ink, carried on the breath of the earth itself. But we rarely listen. We rarely sit still long enough to see, to hear, to receive. When we allow ourselves to sit quietly in nature, when we stop looking at it as scenery and start treating it as scripture, it begins to reveal truths. Impermanence. The stars we see tonight might already be gone, their light reaching us long after they've faded. Patience. Mountains do not rush to grow tall, nor rivers to carve their paths. Connection. The wind that touches your face has traveled across oceans, over cities, through trees. It has been. Presence. A leaf doesn't wonder what tomorrow will bring. It simply exists in its brief, green moment. Nature doesn't preach. It doesn't demand. It invites. It invites us to see, to feel, to slow down, to belong. Daniel realized something as he stared into the sky. His problems, the emails waiting unanswered, the bills stacked on his kitchen counter, the gnawing ache of regret in his chest, they felt small. Not unimportant, not meaningless. Just small. The sky didn't diminish his humanity, it put it in perspective. And strangely, instead of feeling insignificant, he felt free. Because if the universe was this vast, this infinite, then surely there was room for him to simply be, to breathe, to exist, to let go. Sometimes the sacred doesn't give us answers. It doesn't solve our problems, but it reminds us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And sometimes that's enough. In the rush of our daily lives, we rarely look up. We stare at our screens. We keep our heads down as we hurry to our next appointment. We see the sky only as background noise, a passive canvas overhead. But the sky is alive. Every sunset, every sunrise, every constellation scattered across the night is a quiet sermon. A reminder of something older, deeper, and truer than the noise of our minds. Awe isn't something we can force. It's something we allow. To feel awe, we must pause. Stop moving, stop scrolling, stop rushing. Look, not glance, but really look. Breathe. Let yourself feel small, let yourself feel infinite. Awe is not a luxury, it's a spiritual necessity. It humbles us. It grounds us. It reminds us that we are part of something immense. Reflection. When was the last time we let nature teach us something about God? Ask yourself, when was the last time I looked at the stars without distraction? Have I allowed myself to feel small, yet deeply connected? What might I learn if I let nature become my teacher? The divine isn't locked behind stained glass windows or ancient manuscripts. Sometimes it's in the quiet hum of a forest, the ripple of a lake, or the endless expanse of a night sky. Eventually, Daniel stood, his legs stiff and his face cold from the night air. The stars were still there, blinking down at him, unaffected by his presence or his departure. But Daniel felt different. The sky hadn't given him answers. It hadn't solved his problems, but it had reminded him of his smallness, his belonging, and his connection to something vast and infinite. As he walked back to his car, he glanced up one last time and whispered a quiet, almost reflexive, "Thank you." Not to the stars, not to the sky, but to whatever it was that had met him there in the silence. The sacred is waiting, not in distant heavens, but in the quiet vastness of a star-filled sky. Can you pause long enough to let it teach you? Chapter 8. Seasons of the Soul. Nature doesn't resist its seasons. Trees don't cling to their leaves when autumn comes, nor does the earth refuse to bloom when spring arrives. There's a wisdom in this surrender, a rhythm we often forget but desperately need to remember. The forest in autumn. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of earth and decaying leaves. Sunlight filtered through a canopy of orange and gold, painting patterns across the narrow forest path. Clara walked slowly, her boots crunching against the scattered leaves below. Each step felt deliberate, each breath carrying a weight she couldn't quite name. She had come here, into the embrace of the forest, because something inside her felt stuck. Frayed, exhausted. The world around her was shifting, letting go, preparing for stillness. Trees released their leaves without resistance, branches swaying gently in the cool wind as if whispering, "It's time." Clara stopped beside an old maple tree. A single red leaf drifted downward, carried softly by the wind, before landing at her feet. She knelt down, picking up the leaf and holding it in her hand. Its edges were curled, its veins like a delicate map of time past. There was something deeply honest about it, something raw and true. This tree didn't fight the loss of its leaves. It didn't grip them tightly, afraid of what came next. It let go, fully, freely, and without hesitation. And yet, Clara knew this wasn't the end for the tree. The branches wouldn't stay bare forever. Winter would come, yes, but so would spring. The tree trusted its seasons. But did she? We carry seasons within us, whether we realize it or not. Spring, times of renewal, when hope feels fresh and possibilities bloom like flowers after rain. Summer, times of abundance, when everything feels vibrant and full, and life seems to hum with energy. Autumn, times of release, when we let go of what no longer serves us, trusting the wisdom of surrender. Winter, times of stillness, when growth happens quietly below the surface, unseen but essential. These seasons aren't linear. They don't follow the calendar, nor do they come in predictable cycles. But they arrive nevertheless. Sometimes we're in spring in one part of our life and winter in another. Sometimes we rush to escape winter, clinging desperately to the warmth of summer. But nature doesn't rush its seasons. And maybe we shouldn't either. Autumn is a season of letting go, a season of trust. The leaves fall not because the tree has given up, but because it knows it must make space for what comes next. Letting go isn't weakness, it's wisdom. But in our lives, letting go feels harder. Letting go of a relationship we've outgrown. Letting go of a version of ourselves that no longer fits. Letting go of expectations, plans, and timelines. We cling because we're afraid of emptiness, of the unknown, of the bare branches of our lives. But the tree knows something we forget. The letting go is not the end. After autumn comes winter, a season most of us fear. It's quiet, still, and often uncomfortable. Growth isn't visible, and everything seems frozen, lifeless. But beneath the snow, beneath the surface, the earth is preparing. The roots are deepening. The soil is resting. Winter isn't death, it's preparation. But in our lives, we often resist these winter seasons. We avoid rest because it feels unproductive. We avoid stillness because it feels empty. We avoid silence because it confronts us with ourselves. But winter has a purpose. It's where the next chapter begins, slowly, quietly, in ways we cannot yet see. No winter lasts forever. Eventually, the frost begins to melt. Tiny green buds appear on branches that once looked dead. The air shifts, the sun lingers a little longer, and life begins again. Spring isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with trumpets or fanfare. It arrives gently. The same is true for our lives. After a season of heartbreak, hope begins to bloom again. After a season of exhaustion, energy begins to return. After a season of stillness, movement feels possible once more. But we can't force spring. We can't rush it or demand it arrive early. All we can do is trust that it will come. What season are you in? As Clara stood beneath the canopy of golden leaves, she realized something. She had been fighting her own season. She had been clinging to leaves that were ready to fall, afraid of what bare branches might mean. But as she watched the trees let go, she realized there was beauty in it. There was peace and surrender. And there was trust that winter would come, and after winter, spring. She took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill her lungs, and whispered softly, "It's time to let go." Nature doesn't fight its seasons. It doesn't rush spring. It doesn't cling to summer. It doesn't fear winter. It moves with them, gracefully, honestly, and with trust. And maybe that's the invitation for us, too. To notice the season we're in. To honor it without rushing or resisting. To trust that whatever comes next is exactly what's needed. What season of the soul are you in right now? Ask yourself, am I in a season of blooming, abundance, letting go, or stillness? Am I resisting this season, or am I allowing it to teach me? What might happen if I trusted the rhythm of my own soul's seasons? Each season has a purpose. Each season carries wisdom. Spring is joyful. Summer is abundant. Autumn is honest. Winter is restorative. The sacred doesn't only live in the blooming, it lives in the letting go, the resting, the quiet waiting. Clara tucked the red leaf into her coat pocket and turned back toward the path. The forest felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She walked more slowly, her breath steady, her steps softer. The trees whispered above her, their bare branches reaching skyward like open hands. And for the first time in months, Clara felt at peace with her season. Not rushing it, not fearing it, just being in it. Because seasons aren't failures or punishments, they're invitations. Invitations to trust, to let go, to rest, to bloom. The sacred is waiting, not in rushing through your season, but in surrendering to it. Can you honor the season your soul is in right now? Chapter 9, The Sacred in Small Things. Wonder is a bridge, a narrow, delicate path that connects the human heart to something infinite. But to walk that bridge, we must learn to see again, to notice again, to let the small things become big in our eyes. The child and the ant. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden rays across the park. A warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant flowers. Samira sat on a picnic blanket nearby, flipping through emails on her phone while her son, Leo, crouched a few feet away, his face close to the ground. "Look, Mama." Leo's voice broke through her focus. "Look at him." Samira glanced up briefly. "What is it, sweetheart?" "It's an ant. He's carrying this huge leaf." She smiled faintly, her eyes drifting back to the screen. "That's amazing, honey." But Leo wasn't satisfied with her distracted response. "No, Mama. You have to see him." Something in his voice, earnest, unfiltered wonder, caught her attention. She put down her phone and walked over to where Leo crouched. There, in a patch of sunlit dirt, a tiny ant carried a leaf 10 times its size. It wobbled slightly under the weight, but it kept moving, determined, unwavering. Samira squatted down beside Leo, her knees pressing into the grass. "Wow," she whispered. The ant, so impossibly small, carried its burden with a kind of unassuming grace. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't defeated. It simply moved. For several minutes, neither Samira nor Leo spoke. They just watched. And in that shared stillness, a doorway opened, a doorway into wonder, into presence, into something sacred. Wonder is often painted as something grand, something found in mountaintop sunsets, star-filled skies, or the roar of an ocean wave. But wonder isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a child marveling at an ant. Sometimes it's the light filtering through leaves in the early morning. Sometimes it's the way steam rises from a hot cup of tea on a cold day. The sacred isn't reserved for the extraordinary. It lives quietly in the ordinary, waiting patiently for us to notice. But we rarely notice, do we? We walk past flowers without seeing them. We sip our coffee without tasting it. We brush against moments of wonder without pausing to let them settle into us. We've forgotten how to marvel. But children, they still remember. As children, everything is a miracle. A caterpillar inching along a branch. The way rain sounds on a tin roof. The shape of clouds shifting in the sky. But as we grow older, life becomes efficient. We categorize. We rationalize. We stop asking why. And start asking, what's next? Wonder gets overshadowed by productivity. But the cost of losing wonder is steep. Without it, the world becomes dull, transactional, and hollow. We start living on autopilot, missing the sacred threads woven into every corner of our day. Leo saw something Samira didn't. Not because the ant was invisible to her, but because she wasn't looking. The ant wasn't just carrying a leaf, it was carrying meaning. It was carrying a reminder that small doesn't mean insignificant. That persistence can be quiet and unassuming. That the world is full of marvels if we slow down enough to see them. The ant didn't stop being sacred when Samira wasn't watching. But the moment she saw, really saw, it became a doorway. If nature is scripture, then every small thing is a verse. The way water droplets cling to a spiderweb in the morning light. The warmth of fresh bread, broken and shared. The way someone's eyes crinkle when they laugh. These moments are invitations. They are little altars scattered throughout our day, asking us to stop, to notice, to marvel. But here's the thing. These altars are easy to miss. They don't demand attention. They don't shout. They whisper. And wonder begins when we learn to listen. If we want to rediscover wonder, we must become students again, students of the small. Pause when something catches your eye. Look closer. Ask questions. Let yourself feel the quiet amazement of not knowing. Because wonder doesn't require answers. It requires presence. It requires us to let go of the need to understand and simply experience. Leo didn't ask why the ant could carry such a heavy leaf. He didn't analyze its movements. He just marveled. And in that marveling, he touched something sacred. The world isn't lacking in sacredness. It's overflowing with it. The problem isn't that the sacred isn't there. It's that we've stopped paying attention. We look past what's right in front of us. We dismiss the small in search of the grand. We forget that holiness isn't just in temples. It's in the way sunlight hits a dusty window pane. Attention is the currency of wonder. And wonder is the doorway to the divine. Have we forgotten how to marvel at the ordinary? Ask yourself, when was the last time I felt true wonder? Do I rush past the small, sacred moments in my day? What might happen if I started seeing small things as doorways to something holy? Wonder isn't something we need to search for. It's already here. In the ant. In the leaf. In the quiet way a child sees the world without expectation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Samira and Leo packed up their picnic blanket. But something had shifted. Samira noticed the golden light stretching across the field, the faint hum of crickets beginning their nightly chorus, the way Leo's small hand felt warm in hers. The sacred wasn't in some distant place. It was here. It had been here all along, waiting to be seen. Leo skipped ahead, his laughter trailing behind him, and Samira paused for one more glance at the patch of dirt where the ant had disappeared. She smiled. Sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest truths. Sometimes the tiniest creatures become the greatest teachers. The sacred is waiting, not in grand miracles, but in the quiet marvel of small things. Can you slow down long enough to see them? Chapter 10. Rituals of Reverence. Rituals are not about grand gestures or complex ceremonies. They're about presence. A simple candle, a deep breath, a quiet moment, they become sacred not because of their form, but because of our attention. The candle and the evening. The room was dim, the hum of the day still faintly vibrating in the walls. Distant sounds of traffic filtered through the half-closed window, and the air carried the faint scent of rain-soaked pavement. David sat in his worn armchair, a small wooden table beside him. On the table sat a single white candle, unlit. This was his ritual. Every evening, no matter how chaotic the day had been, no matter how cluttered his thoughts still felt. He struck a match, the sharp scent of sulfur briefly cutting through the air before the flame bloomed. As he touched the flickering flame to the wick, he whispered a quiet word. Not a prayer in the traditional sense, but a word that felt steady, anchoring. Here. The candle caught, its light dancing softly on the walls, and David sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the gentle flame. For a few minutes, 5, 10, sometimes more, he simply sat. No phone. No emails. No noise. The candle's light wasn't extraordinary, and the act of lighting it wasn't profound in itself. But it was his. A small, unassuming ritual that anchored him. Every single evening, to a stillness, a sacredness, a reminder. You are here. This moment is enough. Rituals have existed as long as humanity itself. A morning cup of tea sipped in silence. A deep breath before beginning a task. A candle lit in the quiet of evening. Rituals aren't defined by their grandeur. They're defined by their intention. In a world that feels increasingly untethered, days blurring into each other, attention scattered across 1,000 demands, rituals become anchors. They remind us to pause, notice, breathe. They offer structure, not the rigid kind, but the gentle kind that holds space for stillness, for reflection, for presence. It's easy to dismiss small rituals as insignificant, unnecessary, or even indulgent. How can lighting a candle change anything? What difference does a quiet cup of tea make? Why pause when there's so much to do? But these small rituals carry weight because they are intentional. They say, this moment matters. They say, I am here. They say, there is something sacred in simply being. When David lights his candle each evening, he's not changing the world. He's not solving problems. But he's showing up, for himself, for the moment, for whatever quiet sacredness flickers in the flame. And sometimes that's enough. There's a difference between ritual and routine. Routine is brushing your teeth every night because it's what you're supposed to do. Ritual is brushing your teeth while reflecting on the day, letting the act become a small moment of gratitude. Routines are practical. They keep life moving. Rituals are sacred. They ask us to notice. The same act, a cup of coffee, a moment of silence, a lit candle, can be either routine or ritual. The difference isn't in the action, it's in the intention. You don't need an elaborate altar or a perfectly scripted prayer to create a ritual. Rituals can be a quiet breath before a meeting, a moment of gratitude before a meal, 5 minutes of stillness in the morning light. These small acts become sacred because we treat them as such. They become reminders. That time is a gift. That presence is powerful. That life isn't just about the big moments. It's about the small, quiet ones too. David's candle wasn't magical. It wasn't special. But the moment it created, the stillness, the space, that was sacred. If you don't already have a ritual, here's a truth. You probably already do. You just haven't named it yet. The way you sip your tea before the house wakes up. The walk you take after lunch, just to clear your head. The deep breath you take before answering a difficult email. When you begin to see these moments as rituals, they change. They become touchstones. They become altars scattered throughout your day. Rituals are steady. They are consistent when life isn't. When the day feels chaotic, the ritual holds still. When your mind feels restless, the ritual invites you to pause. When you feel disconnected, the ritual reminds you of presence. Rituals aren't about control, they're about trust. Trusting that this small act carries meaning. Trusting that stillness is worth returning to. Trusting that, in showing up for the small things, we create space for something larger to emerge. What small act can become your daily sacred ritual? Ask yourself, is there something I already do every day that could become a ritual? What small act brings me back to myself, to stillness, to presence? Can I set aside a few moments each day to simply be? Your ritual doesn't need to be elaborate. It doesn't need to be long. It just needs to be yours. David sat in his chair, the candle flickering softly on the small wooden table beside him. He didn't check the time. He didn't rush to finish. He just sat, And for those few moments, the world narrowed to the glow of the flame and the quiet rise and fall of his breath. When the candle burned low, David whispered his word again. Here. And he blew out the flame. The smoke curled upward, carrying with it something unspoken, gratitude, stillness, a kind of quiet prayer. David rose from his chair, lighter somehow, anchored by the ritual he had returned to yet again. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. The sacred is waiting, not in grand ceremonies, but in the small rituals we return to day after day. Can you create a space in your day to honor it? Chapter 11. Gratitude as a Gateway. Gratitude isn't about waiting to feel thankful. It's about choosing to notice. It's about lifting the veil on the ordinary and seeing the quiet miracles hiding in plain sight. The woman and her journal. The soft glow of a desk lamp spilled across the open pages of a worn leather journal. Outside the window, the sky was bruised with the fading colors of twilight, and the first stars had begun to prick through the darkening canvas. Sophia sat cross-legged in her favorite armchair, her pen hovering over the blank page. At the top, she'd written the same 3 words she wrote every evening. Today, I'm grateful for. But tonight, the words didn't flow. Her day had been filled with stress, a broken coffee maker, emails piling up faster than she could answer them, a frustrating conversation with her boss. Gratitude felt distant, almost mocking. She tapped the pen against the journal, staring at the empty lines. And then she noticed it, a faint breeze coming through the cracked window, carrying with it the smell of rain-soaked pavement. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. When she opened them again, she wrote, "The smell of rain." Her eyes drifted to the steaming mug of chamomile tea beside her. She wrote, "A warm cup of tea in my hands." From somewhere in the apartment building, faint piano music filtered through the walls, a neighbor, lost in their own moment of creation. She wrote, "The sound of piano keys in the quiet of evening." Her shoulders softened as her pen continued moving, her list growing. The day hadn't changed. The coffee maker was still broken. Her boss was still demanding. But something inside her had changed. Gratitude had opened a door. Not to a different day, but to a different way of seeing. Gratitude isn't an emotion, it's a practice. It's not about waiting to feel thankful. It's about choosing to notice. The way sunlight pools on the kitchen floor in the morning. The smell of clean laundry fresh from the dryer. The comforting weight of a pet curled up beside you. These moments are not loud. They don't wave their arms to get our attention. But gratitude is a way of seeing. It's a pair of glasses we put on to notice what's already here. When life feels heavy, when we're grieving, exhausted, or overwhelmed, gratitude feels like a hollow exercise. It's easy to dismiss it as naive or even insensitive. How can I be grateful when everything feels broken? How can I focus on gratitude when I'm barely holding on? But gratitude isn't about ignoring pain or pretending everything is fine. It's about noticing what's also true. Yes, today was hard. And also, someone held the door open for me. Yes, I'm struggling. And also, the sky was painted pink this morning. Yes, I feel lost. And also, I was given another day to try again. Gratitude doesn't erase pain, but it does make space for beauty to coexist with it. We tend to reserve gratitude for the big things. Promotions, milestones, celebrations. But the sacred doesn't just live in the extraordinary, it thrives in the ordinary. A perfectly ripe strawberry. The sound of a loved one's laugh. The stillness of early morning before the world wakes up. Sophia's journal didn't ask for monumental gratitude. It asked for specific gratitude. And specificity is where gratitude becomes real. Not, I'm grateful for my family, but I'm grateful for the way my mother hums while she cooks. Not, I'm grateful for my home, but I'm grateful for the patch of sunlight that lands on my couch every afternoon. Gratitude lives in the details. Gratitude doesn't just change how we feel, it changes how we see. It transforms a crowded commute into a chance to witness humanity in motion. It turns an ordinary meal into a sacred ritual of nourishment. It shifts the light coming through the window from something unnoticed to something holy. Gratitude doesn't change the world, it changes us. It shifts our focus from scarcity to abundance, from what's missing to what's here, from restlessness to stillness. Why do we resist gratitude? Sometimes it's because it feels too simple, too small. How can a warm mug of tea make a difference? How can noticing the stars change anything? But gratitude isn't about changing the external world. It's about softening the internal one. It's about allowing small moments to become anchors, reminders of beauty, presence, and enoughness. Gratitude doesn't solve everything. It doesn't erase grief, heal trauma, or prevent bad days. But it walks with us. It holds our hand on hard days. It whispers reminders of beauty when everything feels gray. It becomes a lantern, casting light on the good that coexists with the difficult. Gratitude is not a one-time event. It's a practice. And like any practice, it grows stronger with repetition. Can we see every ordinary moment as a gift? Ask yourself, what are 3 small things I'm grateful for today? Do I wait for big reasons to be grateful, or can I find gratitude in the ordinary? How might my day change if I approached it with a lens of gratitude? Gratitude isn't about waiting for perfect moments. It's about noticing the imperfect ones and finding beauty in them anyway. Sophia closed her journal and set her pen down. She looked around her small living room. The warm light from the lamp, the faint sound of rain starting up again, the gentle steam rising from her mug. Nothing had changed. But somehow everything had changed. Gratitude hadn't fixed her broken coffee maker. It hadn't resolved the tension with her boss. But it had opened a door she could step through any time she chose. She whispered a quiet thank you into the stillness of the room. Not to anyone in particular, just to this, to the moment, to the ordinary beauty she had almost missed. And for a moment, everything felt enough. The sacred is waiting, not in grand gestures, but in the small, overlooked gifts scattered through your day. Can you pause long enough to see them? Chapter 12. Imperfection and Grace. The sacred isn't found in flawless execution or unbroken consistency. It's in the apology whispered after sharp words, in the hand extended after a mistake, in the quiet courage to try again. Grace lives in the spaces where we let ourselves be human. The father and the apology. The hallway was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock in the kitchen. The evening had settled heavily over the house, and the smell of dinner still lingered in the air. James sat on the edge of his son's bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. Across from him, Ben, only 8 years old, sat cross-legged, his face turned slightly away, his small hands gripping the edge of his blanket. The argument had been brief but sharp. It started with spilled juice, an accident, nothing more. But James had been tired, stretched thin from deadlines at work and bills piling up on the counter. His patience had been paper-thin, and his voice had risen too quickly, too harshly. Ben's eyes had welled with tears, and the sight of them had felt like a knife twisting in James's chest. Now, in the quiet stillness of Ben's bedroom, James felt the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He cleared his throat, his voice soft but firm. "Ben, I'm sorry." The words sat heavy in the air, but they were real, raw, and unpolished. Ben turned slightly, his wide eyes meeting his father's. "I shouldn't have yelled at you. It wasn't your fault. I was frustrated about other things, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair." For a moment, there was silence. James held his breath. Then Ben nodded, his lips curling slightly into a small, hesitant smile. "It's okay, Dad." James reached out, ruffling his son's hair before pulling him into a hug. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the sharpness of his earlier words. But it was real. And in that small moment, imperfect, fragile, honest, something sacred passed between them. We carry an impossible weight. The belief that love, parenting, relationships, and even spirituality should look perfect. The perfect parent who never raises their voice. The perfect friend who never forgets a birthday. The perfect partner who always knows the right thing to say. But perfection is a mirage, a shimmering illusion on the horizon that we chase but never reach. And when we inevitably fail, we feel shame. I should have done better. Why do I keep making the same mistake? Why can't I just get it right? But what if the sacred doesn't live in getting it right? What if it lives in trying again? Grace doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't ask for flawless performances or polished appearances. Grace shows up in the father who apologizes after losing his temper, in the friend who admits they were wrong and asks for forgiveness, in the partner who tries, fails, and tries again. The sacred isn't about never messing up. It's about what we do after we mess up. Do we retreat into shame, or do we step forward into vulnerability? Do we pretend it didn't happen, or do we acknowledge our humanness with honesty? It's in these messy, raw moments that grace moves freely. Grace feels hard because it requires us to face ourselves, to see our flaws, our shortcomings, and our imperfections without flinching. It asks us to soften toward ourselves when our instinct is to criticize. It asks us to extend kindness when shame wants to slam the door. It asks us to believe we're worthy of love even when we don't feel lovable. But grace isn't something we earn. It's something we receive. Not because we're perfect, but because we're human. James's apology wasn't just about repairing the moment. It was about building a bridge. A bridge made of vulnerability, honesty, and love. It said, I see where I failed and I'm willing to own it. It said, you are worth my humility, my apology, my effort. It said, this relationship matters more than my pride. In our imperfections, we have a choice: to build walls around our shame, or to build bridges with our courage. Grace is the material that makes those bridges possible. Grace isn't just something we offer to others. It's something we need to allow ourselves to receive. Can we let grace meet us? In our failures? In our exhaustion? In our humanness? When we stumble, and we will stumble, grace is the hand extended toward us, saying, you're still worthy. You can try again. It doesn't erase the stumble, but it helps us stand back up. Grace is not a one-time event. It's a practice. It's choosing to apologize even when it feels uncomfortable. It's forgiving yourself when you fall short again. It's showing up, not perfectly, but authentically. Grace is not about earning love. It's about receiving it. For yourself. For others. For the fragile, messy beauty of being human. Can we allow grace to meet us in our imperfections? Ask yourself, how do I respond when I make a mistake? With shame or with grace? Am I quick to offer grace to others but slow to offer it to myself? What might change if I believed my imperfections were not obstacles to love, but opportunities for grace? Grace doesn't ask for perfection. It simply asks us to show up. With honesty. With humility. With a willingness to try again. As James stood in the doorway of Ben's room, he watched his son curl under the blankets, his breathing slowing, his small shoulders rising and falling. He turned off the light, but before closing the door, he whispered into the dark, I love you, buddy. I'll always keep trying. Ben's voice, sleepy but clear, answered back, love you too, Dad. James walked down the hallway, the weight in his chest a little lighter. He hadn't gotten it perfect, but he had shown up. And sometimes that's enough. Because love doesn't require us to be perfect. It asks us to be present. And grace fills the spaces in between. The sacred isn't in perfection. It's in the moments when we admit our humanness, extend grace, and try again. Can you let grace meet you where you are? Chapter 13. Being a conduit for light. We are not meant to be reservoirs, hoarding love, kindness, and light for ourselves. We are meant to be conduits. Open channels through which something larger flows freely into the world. When we stop blocking that flow, even the smallest act can become a radiant offering. The woman and the stranger. The cafe was loud with the chatter of conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional clatter of cups against saucers. Maya sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. She was there to escape her crowded apartment, to find a pocket of stillness amidst the hum of the city. She barely noticed the man at the counter until she overheard the cashier's hesitant voice. I'm sorry, sir, but your card, it's been declined again. The man, a tall figure in a worn-out coat, shifted awkwardly, his shoulders sinking slightly. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and began to turn away. Maya didn't think. She acted. She stood up, walked to the counter, and spoke softly. Excuse me. I'll cover his coffee. The man turned, his eyes wide, his voice hesitant. You don't have to. I want to, Maya said, smiling faintly. Please. The cashier rang up the coffee, and Maya stepped aside as the man collected his drink. Before he left, he paused, looked her in the eye, and said, Thank you. You have no idea how much this means today. He walked out, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. Maya returned to her seat, her tea now lukewarm, but her chest warm with something else. Something quiet yet profound. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. Just a small kindness, a fleeting moment. But it felt significant. And maybe she thought that's how light works. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need applause. It just moves from one person to another, leaving something brighter in its wake. Light isn't something we create. It's something we allow. When sunlight streams through a crack in a wall, it doesn't force its way. It simply enters. When a river flows through an open channel, it doesn't hesitate, it simply moves. In the same way, love, kindness, and light aren't things we own. They're things we carry. When we let them flow through us, when we offer them freely, without expectation, they become something more. They become sacred. If love and kindness are so natural, why do we block them? Fear. What if my kindness isn't appreciated? What if I'm taken advantage of? Pride. What if I look foolish? What if I'm rejected? Scarcity. What if I give too much and have nothing left for myself? But love isn't a finite resource. Kindness doesn't diminish when shared, it multiplies. The river doesn't lose water as it flows, it gains momentum. When we cling too tightly to our light, hoard it, protect it, ration it, we stop being conduits. We become dams. And the light, the love, the energy, it stagnates. But when we open ourselves, when we let it flow, something miraculous happens. Maya's act of kindness wasn't grand. It didn't require sacrifice or applause. But it mattered. What if that man walked away from the cafe feeling just a little more seen, a little less alone? What if that small moment of grace became the reason he offered kindness to someone else later that day? Kindness isn't linear, it's exponential. A smile given to a stranger might echo in their day in ways we'll never see. A kind word spoken at the right moment might save someone from the edge of despair. A small, unprompted act of generosity might become the catalyst for someone else's courage. We rarely see the full impact of our light, but that doesn't mean it's not working. To become a conduit for light, we must stay open, open hearts, open hands, open minds. 2. Release fear. Trust that kindness isn't weakness and love isn't naivety. 3. Let go of outcome. Act without expectation. Let kindness be a gift, not a transaction. 4. Stay connected to the source, whether through prayer, meditation, stillness, or gratitude. Stay connected to the well from which love flows. The world doesn't need us to be reservoirs, hoarding light and kindness for perfect moments. It needs us to be rivers. Let it flow through you, unhindered, unblocked, unafraid. Being a conduit isn't about being a hero. It's not about grand speeches. It's not about perfect timing. It's not about fixing everything. It's about showing up. It's about letting love move through you. Quietly, consistently, imperfectly. Maya didn't change the world in that cafe. But she changed something. And sometimes that's enough. When we let light move through us, we participate in something larger than ourselves. It feels sacred because it is sacred. A mother calming a frightened child. A stranger offering directions to someone who's lost. A friend showing up, even when they don't have the right words. These moments are the threads that hold the world together. They aren't loud. They aren't celebrated. But they matter. How can we let love move through us unblocked? Ask yourself, what stops me from offering love or kindness freely? When was the last time I let myself be a vessel for something larger than myself? What simple act of kindness can I offer today, without expectation or hesitation? You don't need to fix the world. You just need to let light move through you. A word, a smile, a small, unassuming act of care. That's where the sacred flows. As Maya finished her tea and gathered her things, she glanced once more at the cafe door where the man had left. She would never know how the rest of his day unfolded, what those small moments of kindness might have sparked in him. But that didn't matter, because light doesn't ask for recognition. It simply moves. Maya walked out into the evening air, her steps light, her chest warm. And somewhere, carried softly on the current of a single unassuming moment, her light continued to flow. The sacred is waiting, not in grand gestures, but in small moments where love moves freely through you. Can you let yourself be a vessel for light today? Chapter 14, Sacred in the Mundane. We keep searching for holiness in grand places, in moments carved out of time, in distant destinations. But holiness isn't somewhere else, it's here. It's in the quiet hum of the everyday, in the spaces we overlook, in the ordinary moments we rush past. The sacred isn't hiding. It's waiting to be seen. The man at the bus stop. The bus stop bench was cold against Thomas's back. Above him, the sky hung heavy with low clouds, threatening rain. Cars whizzed past in bursts of sound and color. Somewhere nearby, a bird chirped, persistent, bright, unbothered by the traffic roar. Thomas sat with his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his breath forming faint clouds in the crisp air. He was in no hurry. The bus schedule had long become irrelevant in his mind. The world moved around him. A mother gently adjusting her child's scarf before walking toward the crosswalk. A young man tapping his foot nervously, eyes glued to his phone screen. An elderly woman, her cane tapping a soft rhythm against the pavement. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make headlines. And yet, everything felt alive. Thomas watched the mother's hands, the way they moved with quiet care as she fixed the scarf. He noticed the way the young man's brow furrowed with concentration as he read whatever news flashed across his screen. He listened to the faint shuffle of the elderly woman's shoes as she slowly made her way down the sidewalk. For a brief moment, everything felt suspended, woven together by invisible threads of connection. This is sacred, Thomas thought, though he couldn't have explained why. The bus arrived with a sigh of brakes and a hiss of air, but Thomas didn't stand up. Not yet. He wanted to stay in this moment just a little longer, to keep seeing the world not as scenery, not as background noise, but as something holy. We live most of our lives in the mundane, in traffic jams and grocery store lines, in dishwashing and email replies, in waiting rooms and coffee breaks. It's easy to dismiss these moments as placeholders, unimportant, forgettable. But what if they aren't placeholders at all? What if these ordinary moments are sacred ground? What if holiness isn't reserved for temples, cathedrals, or mountaintops, but spills over into sidewalks, office cubicles, and crowded bus stops? The sacred isn't defined by where we are. It's defined by how we see. We rush. Through conversations. Through tasks. Through meals. We rush through the small, ordinary details of life as if they're obstacles blocking our way to something more important. But in our rush, we miss so much. The way light filters through the leaves of a tree. The scent of bread baking in a nearby cafe. The quiet weight of someone's hand resting on our shoulder. The world isn't lacking in sacredness. We are just too distracted, too hurried, too restless to see it. Reverence doesn't require a special setting. It's not something reserved for Sunday mornings or silent retreats. Reverence is a way of seeing. It's noticing the extraordinary hidden in the ordinary. The way steam rises from a cup of tea. The softness of a child's laughter. The stillness of an early morning before the world wakes up. Reverence happens when we let ourselves behold. Not glance, not skim, but behold. It's not about adding something to our day. It's about paying attention to what's already there. Holiness doesn't shout. It doesn't wave its arms to get our attention. It waits, quietly, patiently, in the spaces we usually overlook. In the rhythm of our own breath. In the warmth of the sun on our skin. In the pause between words in a deep conversation. These aren't just moments to pass through. They're doorways. Doorways into something deeper, something timeless, something holy. But we have to pause. We have to notice. Presence transforms everything. When we are fully present, the mundane becomes meaningful. The ordinary becomes sacred. Time slows down, and small moments expand with quiet beauty. Thomas's moment at the bus stop wasn't extraordinary. But because he paused, because he saw, it became sacred. And here's the secret. Every moment carries that same potential. Every glance, every breath, every seemingly insignificant detail. But only if we let ourselves see. You don't need to change your life to experience the sacred in the mundane. You just need to notice. Notice the way your coffee smells in the morning. Notice the sound of leaves crunching under your feet. Notice the fleeting beauty of a stranger's smile. Attention isn't passive, it's active. It's a choice to show up fully in the small spaces of your day. Holiness isn't about grandeur. It's about meaning. When Thomas sat on that cold bench, watching life move around him, he didn't do anything special. But he noticed. He let himself see, not just the people, but the humanity in them. Not just the noise, but the music hidden inside it. And in that seeing, he touched something sacred. What if every breath, every step, every glance was sacred? Ask yourself, do I rush past the ordinary moments of my day without noticing them? When was the last time I truly paid attention to something small and unremarkable? What might change if I treated every moment as an opportunity for reverence? The sacred isn't hiding. It's right here, in the quiet hum of your daily life. All it asks is that you notice. The bus doors opened with a hiss, and Thomas finally stood, his knees creaking as he moved toward the steps. He dropped his coins into the fare box, found a seat by the window, and let his gaze drift back outside. The world was still moving. People walking, cars passing, birds flitting between branches. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had changed. Because now Thomas was seeing. He wasn't just passing through the world, he was in it. Fully. Quietly. Reverently. The sacred is waiting, not somewhere far away, but in the moments we so often overlook. Can you slow down long enough to see the holiness in the ordinary? Conclusion: the sacred is here. We spend so much of our lives searching for meaning, for connection, for God. We climb mountains, sit in silence, travel to distant places, hoping to stumble upon the divine. But what if the sacred isn't hiding at all? What if it's been here the whole time, woven into the fabric of our ordinary lives, waiting patiently to be noticed? The grand search. We are seekers by nature. We seek purpose in our careers. We seek connection in our relationships. We seek peace in quiet spaces. And for those of us who seek the sacred, we often imagine it as something out there, something waiting in faraway lands, ancient texts, or the rare and fleeting mountaintop moments of revelation. But for all our searching, we often overlook the most obvious truth. The sacred isn't distant. It's here, not in some ethereal realm beyond reach, but here, in your kitchen, in your relationships, in your breath. The mistake isn't in seeking, it's in where we're looking. We look past the mundane in search of the profound. We dismiss ordinary moments because they don't feel sacred. We believe holiness must come with trumpets and light shows. But holiness doesn't wear neon signs. It doesn't announce itself. It waits, in the spaces we rush through, in the silences we fill with noise, in the moments we deem too small to matter. In the way sunlight spills across the kitchen floor. In the shared silence between two people who understand each other deeply. In the weight of a child's head resting on your shoulder. Everywhere you look, there are small altars, places where the sacred hums softly, waiting for your attention. But you have to look. Attention is the currency of the sacred. It's not about escaping your life to find God. It's about entering your life fully, noticing what you usually miss, and realizing that the sacred isn't hiding. It's simply quiet. The warmth of tea in your hands on a cold morning. The way your breath rises and falls without you thinking about it. The fleeting smile of a stranger on a crowded street. These moments might seem small, but they aren't insignificant. They are invitations, tiny doorways into something larger, something eternal, something holy. The question isn't whether the sacred is here. The question is, are we still enough to notice? We often believe that finding the sacred means changing our circumstances, moving to a quieter place, escaping the daily grind, achieving some grand spiritual milestone. But the sacred doesn't need perfect conditions. It doesn't ask for silence or candles or pristine moments free of distraction. It simply asks for you, your presence, your attention, your willingness to see. Because when you start to see, everything changes, not because the world has changed, but because you have. A kitchen sink filled with dirty dishes becomes a space of gratitude for the meal shared. A crowded bus becomes a moving cathedral filled with stories, humanity, and life. A routine walk around the neighborhood becomes a meditation on beauty, change, and time. The sacred isn't out of reach. It's been here all along. The journey isn't about finding the sacred. It's about becoming sacred. Becoming a vessel for kindness in a world that feels cold. Becoming a space for stillness in a world that never stops moving. Becoming a conduit for love in a world that often feels harsh. When we let the sacred flow through us, when we let ourselves become a space for light, love, and attention, we stop searching. Because we realize we're already home. Take a breath. Right now, wherever you are, pause. Look around you. What do you see? The texture of your chair. The faint hum of your surroundings. The way light is falling on your hands. This moment, right now, holds holiness. Not because it's grand, but because it's real. The steam rising from your coffee mug, the sound of distant laughter, the weight of your feet planted firmly on the ground. This is holy ground. Right here. Right now. What if God isn't hiding in the extraordinary, but waiting in the ordinary moments we so often overlook? Ask yourself, what small, ordinary moments do I rush past without noticing? How might my life feel different if I treated every breath, every step, every glance as sacred? Can I pause, right now, and notice one small, beautiful thing in front of me? The sacred doesn't need you to climb mountains or cross oceans. It needs you to be here. To show up for your life with open eyes, open hands, and an open heart. As the sun sets on this journey, on these pages, these reflections, these moments, know this. The sacred isn't something you'll find at the end of a quest. It's something you'll encounter every day, in every breath, in every fleeting moment of attention. You don't need to travel far. You don't need to become someone else. You just need to see. See the leaf caught in a spider's web. See the tired smile of a cashier at the end of a long shift. See the way your own breath rises and falls, steady, unwavering. These aren't distractions. They are everything. The sacred isn't somewhere else. It's here. It's always been here. And now perhaps you can see it. The sacred is waiting, not in distant temples or perfect moments, but in the quiet corners of your ordinary life. Can you stop, breathe, and see the holiness already here? A quiet amen. In the end, it's not the grand revelations or the mountaintop moments that shape a life. It's the way we show up for the ordinary. The way we notice the light, the laughter, the quiet. It's the way we say yes to the sacred hidden in plain sight, and how we whisper a quiet amen to the day as it closes. An ordinary day. The day began with light, a soft glow spilling through the curtains, warm and golden against the sheets. The world outside was waking up, but there was no rush. Just the slow unfurling of morning. A kettle whistled in the kitchen. The steam rose in lazy spirals from a mug of tea, curling into the soft light of dawn. The narrator sat by the window, hands wrapped around the warm mug, watching the world come alive outside. A bird hopping along the fence, its song sharp and bright. A neighbor walking their dog, pausing to adjust the leash with gentle hands. The faint hum of distant traffic, a reminder of life's endless motion. It wasn't extraordinary, but it felt alive. Later, there was work, emails, phone calls, spreadsheets. The hum of a computer fan filled the quiet office space. But in between tasks, there were moments. The feeling of sunlight warming the back of a hand. A genuine smile exchanged with a colleague. The sound of rain tapping gently against the window pane. These moments didn't interrupt the day, they made the day. Small, fleeting, sacred. In the evening, there was dinner. Nothing extravagant, just pasta, a glass of water, and the sound of silverware clinking softly against ceramic. The narrator paused for a brief moment before the first bite, letting gratitude settle softly into their chest. Not gratitude for anything grand, just gratitude for this. For the warmth of the food. For the stillness of the moment. For the quiet hum of life unfolding in the background. Finally, there was night. The house exhaled as the lights dimmed, as the day folded itself neatly into the arms of dusk. Outside, the sky stretched wide and deep, dotted with faint pinpricks of light. The narrator stood by the window, breathing in the cool night air, watching the stars flicker in their distant dance. And in that stillness, in that brief, fragile moment, they whispered softly, "Thank you." This day wasn't remarkable. There were no grand revelations, no fireworks of insight, no life-altering epiphanies. But it felt holy, because it was filled with attention. Attention to the softness of morning light. Attention to the music of rain against glass. Attention to the small, unassuming beauty woven into every moment. It's easy to overlook days like this, to dismiss them as just another day. But these are the days that make up a life. Not the mountaintop moments, not the grand arrivals, but the quiet, unnoticed ones. Life isn't one long story. It's a collection of scenes. A cup of tea shared with a friend. A breath taken in stillness after a long day. A fleeting smile exchanged with a stranger on a crowded street. These moments aren't insignificant. They're everything. They're where life happens. They're where the sacred resides. Not waiting for us in some distant future, but here, in the crumbs on the table, the warmth of a blanket, the laughter drifting down the hallway. These are the moments we'll look back on. Not because they were grand, but because they were real. What if holiness isn't something we have to find? What if it's something we have to see? The light is already here. The sacred is already present. In the pauses. In the breath. In the silence between words. Every cup of tea. Every bus ride. Every star-filled sky. These aren't distractions from life. These are life. The day ended the same way it began, with light. This time, the faint glow of a bedside lamp. The narrator sat on the edge of their bed, the book they'd been reading resting gently in their lap. The house was quiet. The world outside was dark and still. There was no rush, no noise, just the faint hum of life continuing on, soft and steady. The narrator closed their eyes and let the weight of the day settle in their chest. It had been an ordinary day, but it had also been sacred, because they had seen it. They had felt it. They had been there. And as the light clicked off and the darkness settled in fully, they whispered into the stillness. Amen. If there's one truth to carry forward, let it be this. The sacred isn't hiding in mountaintops, distant temples, or once-in-a-lifetime moments. It's in the way you stir your coffee. It's in the sound of a loved one's laughter. It's in the way your breath rises and falls as you read these words. The sacred isn't something you find, it's something you notice. It's something you allow. It's something you become. So pause. Look around. Take a breath. And let yourself see. Because the sacred isn't waiting somewhere far away. It's here. It's always been here. Thank you for walking this path, for pausing, for noticing, for seeking and finding. May you carry this quiet amen into every day that follows. The sacred is waiting, and it's already here.